Welcome back to part 2 of our video on every 20th century UK Prime Minister's worst mistake. In the last video, we left off with our good friend Winston Churchill, and he's a man who is perhaps the most well-known Prime Minister in the history of the United Kingdom, but he's not one immune to mistakes, and his is probably the biggest. But before we go to that, let me just start this video by saying, please subscribe. If you subscribe to us, we promise you a lifelong commitment to making content that you, the people, deserve and want. It's very important that you want it as well as deserve it, by the way. Anyway, let's dive into part 2 of this video with our friend Winston Churchill. As said, Winston Churchill is one of the most famous and well-known and quoted prime ministers in the history of the United Kingdom. He is remembered most fondly for his leadership during the Second World War, which of course resulted in a British victory alongside the rest of the Allies. However, he has notable mistakes throughout his career, most notably his, and this is before he was prime minister, his role in the Gallipoli crisis, which resulted in thousands of deaths during the First World War. As Secretary of State for War and Air in 1919, Churchill was known most notably for his deploying the controversial Black and Tans to fight the Irish Republican Army in Ireland. Speaking as a Welsh person, he's also remembered for his act to send in the army against striking workers in South Wales during 1910. So there are many mistakes he made, and of course this is subjective. They might not be mistakes to everyone, but to most people they would be. But his biggest mistake is arguably his handling of the Bengal famine in 1943, which led to the deaths of over 3 million people, and Churchill's actions or lack of action have been the subject of widespread criticism for almost a century, whereas his role in the Bengal famine of 1943 is often a topic of historical debate. It's kind of clear, and critics would argue that Churchill's policies exacerbated the famine. He redirected resources, including food supplies, for the war effort, and there are claims that he resisted diverting ships to transport rice to Bengal. And some argue that his prioritization of military needs over humanitarian concerns contributed to the severity of the famine, and it's well known that Churchill was better as a wartime leader, and this is why he was in charge of the war efforts, while Clement Attlee, more on him later, was more in charge of running the country in the United Kingdom. So Churchill's defenders will say that the Bengal famine was a complex crisis with multiple causes, and on our last video, which was the crimes of the British Empire, which included the Bengal famine, we did have a couple of comments suggest this, and that's fair to point out. They point out that the wartime conditions and disruptions, as well as factors beyond Churchill's control, played significant roles in the famine, but it's important to note that the responsibility for the Bengal famine is a complex historical issue, and it's probably the fault of Winston Churchill in more ways than none. But Churchill was the leader during this time, and given his other controversies of the time, which most notably included a number of disrespectful comments about Mahatma Gandhi, who Churchill once said, "It is alarming and nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir, striding half-naked up the steps of the Vice-Regal Palace." And Churchill even referred to him as a bad man and an enemy of the empire. So there was a disregard for India by Churchill during this time, and given he was the leader, he has to be responsible for much of the Bengal famine. So that's going to be his worst mistake here. Next, we have Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee, like Churchill, is remembered as one of the greatest prime ministers in the United Kingdom's history. However, unlike Churchill, he was known as less of a charismatic figure, and he was known more for his substance. He was the substance to Churchill's style, in essence, which is probably why they did so well together during the Second World War. However, though Attlee has some incredible achievements, most notably the birth of the National Health Service, the NHS, his biggest mistake is one which still has profound effects on the world today, particularly within South Asia, because we're returning to India for this one, folks, okay? So Clement Attlee was largely responsible for the poor mishandling of the partition of India and Pakistan. So one point of criticism often raised of Attlee during this time is the withdrawal of British troops from India in 1947, which led to the partition of the country into India and Pakistan. The manner in which the withdrawal and partition were handled was accompanied by widespread widespread communal violence and mass migrations, which resulted in significant loss of life and displacement. So while the decision to grant independence to India was inevitable and had widespread support, and Attlee was a very early supporter of this in fact, some critics argue that the speed of the withdrawal and the lack of effective plans to manage the partition process contributed to the violence and suffering. Britain was poorer due to the Second World War, and it had less military resources and therefore withdrew entirely. And Attlee's government has faced retrospective criticism for not doing enough to prevent or mitigate the consequences of the partition, which was a brutal and bloody affair. So it's important to note that though Attlee was a very early supporter of Indian independence, the actual process of it, when it occurred and finally fell into place, was not very well executed, and it led to the deaths and misplacement of millions of people and has caused much of the troubles between India and Pakistan, which still exist today. So Attlee, buddy, that one's on you. Next we have Anthony Eden, and if you don't know who that is, that's probably because he was only Prime Minister between 1955 and 1957, and though he was only Prime Minister for a short amount of time, he has one of the most noteworthy mistakes on this list because it's the Suez Crisis of 1956, and this was a major international incident that unfolded when Eden, along with France and Israel, took military action against Egypt in response to the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. And the Suez Crisis is widely regarded as a significant mistake in British foreign policy. Eden's decision to use military force without consulting the United States or the Soviet Union and without proper authorization from the United Nations ultimately led to diplomatic and military failure. The US and Soviet Union, concerned about the potential for the conflict to escalate and disrupt Cold War dynamics, pressured the UK, France and Israel into a humiliating withdrawal and ended the UK's worldwide reputation as a global superpower. And the Suez Crisis damaged Britain's standing on the world stage and had long-lasting consequences for the country's influence in international affairs as a result. Eden's handling of the crisis was criticised not only for its lack of success, but also for the secrecy and deception involved in the planning and execution of the military intervention. It's often considered Anthony Eden's most significant mistake during his time as Prime Minister, and it's why he was Prime Minister for so little time. It essentially destroyed his political career, and it's why he's not really very well regarded by historians today. He wasn't Prime Minister long enough to do much else, so this is one of the few UK Prime Ministers where a mistake defined their entire career. Anyway, next we have Harold McMillan, who was the Conservative Prime Minister between 1957 and 1963. So Harold McMillan was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during some turbulent times. I mean, it's still the post-war era, even though it's been a little while now since the Second World War, but Britain is going through a period of decolonization. It's weaker on the global stage, partly because of Anthony Eden, and it's in a period of decline, essentially. And Harold McMillan is tasked with trying to reverse this, and instead he is remembered in some ways, and in most ways, for one mistake, which wasn't actually him. So the Profumo affair in 1963. So the Profumo affair involved John Profumo, who was the Secretary of State for War in Macmillan's government, and his involvement with Christine Keeler, a model who was romantically linked to a Soviet naval attaché. Profumo initially denied any impropriety in the House of Commons, but as details of the affair emerged, it became clear that he had misled Parliament. The scandal damaged the credibility of the government and contributed to a sense of crisis. Macmillan's handling of the affair and his subsequent reshuffle in the cabinet was seen by some as insufficient to address the public's concerns about integrity and transparency within the government. And while the Profumo affair was not the only challenge faced by Macmillan during his time as PM, it is often cited as a significant event that eroded public trust and contributed to the perception of a government in decline. Macmillan resigned in 1963 and then was followed by his good friend Alec Douglas Hol, who led the Conservative Party into the general election later that year. So the Profumo affair is considered by many as being one of the factors which most contributed to the decline of Macmillan's premiership and his ultimate resignation, so it has to be his worst mistake. As we mentioned, next we have Alec Douglas Hol, who was only Prime Minister for 365 days, and there's not a whole lot of things to judge here. I mean, Rhodesia gained independence during this time, but it wasn't him who instigated the negotiations for that, so it's not really his fault. I mean, we could say the general election loss of 1964 would be his biggest mistake, maybe? I mean, yeah, we're gonna go with that. I can't think of anything else. If you think of something, please let us know in the comment section below. Maybe we're missing something glaringly obvious. Anyway, next we have Harold Wilson, who holds the rare distinction of being Prime Minister on more than one occasion and is the last to do so. So, Harold Wilson is most fondly remembered for social and educational reform during a transformative period for Britain. It finally had exited the post-war period and was looking to modernize its economy and its reputation in the world. But Harold Wilson did make one big mistake. So, in 1967, faced with economic challenges such as trade deficit and a weakening currency, Wilson's government decided to devalue the pound. So, for those who don't know, devaluation involves reducing the value of a country's currency in relation to other countries, making exports more competitive but also leading to higher import prices. And this move was seen by some as a sign of economic weakness and had political repercussions. While devaluation did bring short-term benefits to the British economy, it was perceived as an admission of economic difficulties. Wilson's opponents criticised him for initially denying that devaluation would happen, and the decision may have contributed to a sense of economic decline during his leadership. So while Wilson did enjoy notable achievements, including social and educational reform, it's clear that this was a big mistake on his behalf, and it further emphasised that Britain was a shrinking economy and its influence was waning in the world, and Wilson proved to not be the great modernizer in terms of economic reform that he had hoped to be. Next up, we have Edward Heath, who is widely known as Ted Heath, so that's what we're going to call him, who served as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1970 to 1974. And one of his most significant challenges during his premiership was the issue of industrial relations and trade union conflicts, which mostly escalated during the early 1970s. One of the key moments associated with Heath's tenure was the miners' strike of 1972, which occurred in response to the government's attempt to limit miners' wage increases and the power of trade unions, a common theme with Tory prime ministers, and Labour as well during this time. The strike resulted in power cuts and a 3-day work week, and it significantly damaged Heath's government. However, perhaps Heath's most significant mistake was the decision to call a snap election in February 1974 in an attempt to gain a mandate to confront the economic and industrial challenges facing the country. The election did not produce a clear majority for either the Conservative or Labour parties, and this resulted in a hung parliament. Heath's inabilities to secure a clear mandate and the subsequent failure to form a coalition government ultimately led to his resignation as Prime Minister, which led to him sitting on the back benches of Parliament for the next 30 years or so, just looking like he's constantly sulking, and who can blame him, because this was a silly, unavoidable mistake, Ted Heath. Next, we have James Callaghan, who was the Labour Prime Minister between 1976 and 1979. He became the Prime Minister after the resignation of Harold Wilson due to poor health. And James Callaghan is most infamously remembered for the Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 1979. This was a period of widespread strikes and industrial unrest that occurred during the winter of 78 and 79. Various public sector unions, including those representing workers in hospitals, schools and public services, engaged in strikes and other forms of industrial action. The strikes led to significant disruptions, with public services being severely affected. And critics and historians rightfully argue that Callaghan's government handling of the situation was inadequate, and some attribute the perceived weakness to his decision not to call a general election during that time. After all, he was an unelected Prime Minister succeeding Harold Wilson. Despite the challenges, Callaghan opted to carry on with the existing Parliament, which ultimately led to a vote of no confidence in his government in 1979. And again, he's a Labour Prime Minister, and for a Labour Prime Minister to have a winter of discontent involving striking workers, this is surely the ultimate shame for a Labour Prime Minister. So yeah, it led to Margaret Thatcher achieving a decisive landslide victory, and yeah, Callaghan, that's where you belong, my friend. You're forgotten about, rightfully so. Next, we have Margaret Thatcher. And by next, I'm meaning the next episode, because we're already at 13 minutes and this is going on too long. So we're going to split this into 3 parts. The third part will be here on Friday. Did I know from the very beginning that this was probably going to be another 3-part video? Yes. Did I discreetly hide it from you for any particular reason? No. But here we go. I'm telling you now. It's going to be a 3-part series again, and the third part will be here on Friday. So if you, my friend, wish to subscribe to us, you should do so right now. Please hit the subscribe button. We are desperate for your subscription. And you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Collective Histories page. And then you can follow us on Instagram at The Collective Histories. And then if that's not enough, you can follow us on X or Twitter at twitter.com/Collective Histo. And then you should buy me a coffee, please. And that's buymeacoffee.com/Collective Histories. And then once you've done that, you can watch our content to your heart's content. You should do so every single day without fail. When you wake up, when you go to sleep, when in the daytime, when you're having dinner, when you're having breakfast, when you're having supper, just keep watching our videos, please. Anyway, I'll see you on Friday. Have a lovely couple of days, and yeah, enjoy the mistakes of the former prime ministers and don't enjoy the current ones too much. Okay, goodbye.